We now know which Big 12 teams Utah football will be playing against for not just the next year, but the next 4 years at both home and away sites. Did Utah get a good draw? And what does this mean for the future of Utah football? Let's talk about it on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen every single day. We are available on all platforms, including YouTube and wherever you may get your podcast. If this is your first time listening to our show, make sure you like and subscribe. We'd love interacting with you in the comments below. Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. You can go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use the code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Daily fantasy sports made easy. That's PrizePicks. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. And on today's show, we're going to eventually break down what I believe are the keys to victory for Utah against Arizona State. Also talk about some men's basketball predictions I have since their season is about to get underway. They actually had their first exhibition game last night. But first, before we dive into all that, I just want to talk about the Utah's Big 12 opponents being revealed for the future. We don't know the game dates and everything and how the schedule works out. Also, we do know that interesting wrinkle, the Baylor game's still on for next year and still will be considered a non-conference game for Utah. But the BYU game, which was originally considered a non-conference game, that has been shuffled, which makes sense because I think that is going to be placed at the end of the season. I can already see that being the premier 10:30 slot on a Fox or one of those the main networks, because that rivalry does have a lot of value. So I think it makes sense that that date shifted versus Utah Baylor. Nice little pre matchup with the Big 12 team. I think it makes a lot of sense that they kept that one non-conference. And as I mentioned too, we don't just have the 2024 schedule revealed. We have the schedule revealed all the way through 2025. You also have 26, 27 in there. And we know it says the home opponents and the road opponents. So I think this is awesome to have a good schedule layout. Just kind of know what you're in for the next few years. This is, I think it's a really great thing that Utah has kind of that basis to which teams this offseason they'll be wanting to go back and watch and pay a little attention to how their seasons turned out to know what they're in for. So first, let's focus on the 2024 slate. For the home opponents, I think Utah made out well. Now, Arizona at Utah is going to be a fun one, I think. Utah's really good at home. I still believe it takes a top 10 caliber team to come into Wistrcill Stadium and get a win. So that's where, looking at this, I think Utah definitely has a good chance still to be unbeaten at home come the conclusion of next year, because they obviously suffered the loss to Oregon. I expect this Saturday against Arizona State, they'll get on the winning path. And, when I look at their 5 conference home games next year, and we can include the Baylor game in that too, I expect Utah to be unbeaten at home. Yes, Arizona should be a pretty decent team next year, but this is a Utah program. Even when the quarterbacks are going to start changing going forward for Utah, right? More than likely it's going to be Bryson Barnes, or excuse me, not Bryson Barnes, of course. More than likely, it's either going to be a Cam Rising or an Isaac Wilson or someone like that. The quarterback will continue to change, but Utah has become one of those programs where I really believe every year we're going to say they run the ball well and they play really good defense. I just think that's the point we're at with these Utah teams. It's been like that for a while now. It's led to them playing and winning championship football. So I just don't expect that to change. So even when teams like Arizona come in, who should be a top 25 team next year and a good team, the noise of Wistrcill Stadium, how elite that Utah defense is. You got a lot of good players coming back next year. Lander Barton being one of them. Some of the talented players along the defensive line. Sione Vaki will continue to do his things on both sides of the ball. I even think going into next year. So that's where I do expect that we'll see Utah be able to beat a team like Arizona. Same thing with BYU, right? BYU it's a rivalry game. That one will be fun to have at Wistrcill Stadium, but BYU's program right now, just in terms of what they did this season in particular, yes, they're capable of coming into Utah and winning. But if you were to say which program's in a better position, it's clearly Utah. Utah has been ranked. They've continued to win Pac-12 championships. BYU had a good year, has had some good seasons, but they're just not right now at the same level as Utah as a program when you look at that recent success. Once again, doesn't mean they can't come in, but Utah should win that game. Then TCU, Iowa State. TCU should be better next year, but it feels like last year was a fluke for them. And I just think it's really hard to win in Wistrcill Stadium. So that's where I think Utah will be able to beat TCU. And yes, Utah will beat Iowa State as well, who they're struggling a little bit right now too. But I think Matt Campbell's a really good coach. It's going to be a lot of fun breaking down all these teams and kind of what they bring to the Big 12 or what they bring to Utah to the Big 12, Utah going into the Big 12 against them going forward. Looking at the road opponents, going to Arizona State. Fitting because we're going to be talking about that a lot to the rest of the show today. But yeah, Utah should win that one. At Colorado, that's going to be a fun one. I think Utah will win that one still, but man, let's see what kind of players in the trenches Deion Sanders can get, right? We know he's already been able to recruit the big names, and I do expect Shedeur Sanders to be back. I know it's a big thing, like, oh, he's one of the 3 best quarterbacks in the NFL draft. I just think he's going to come back and want to play for his dad and, continue to see out what's been a very special season at Colorado. So I do expect him to come back. Utah will win on the road at Houston. Oklahoma State, they're always a pesky team under Mike Gundy. So that's another one that'll be tough, I think, but a very winnable one. And UCF too, another team. They've been, I think they were ranked in the top 25 earlier this season, just suffered a loss, but they've been another decent program under Gus Malzahn. So when you're looking at tough games on Utah's schedule, I think I would go the Colorado game, Oklahoma State, UCF, and you could probably the Arizona game too. I might rope in there just because I do think the Wildcats could be pretty decent this next year. But I mean, that's a favorable schedule because even when I'm like, okay, that could be tough, that feels much more in line with how I talked about how the Arizona game could be tough this year, how the Baylor game could be tough. I don't expect any of the teams Utah's playing to be ranked in the top 15. I think Arizona could be really good and they'll be a top 25 team, but just based on how things are trending for these programs, maybe Oklahoma State could be a top, even them as a top 15 though. I just don't see it right now. Colorado could be the lone exception. I could see them as a top 15 team. So yeah, I just think that compared to this year where you had to play a USC, an Oregon, a Washington, Utah's schedule is pretty favorable for them. And honestly, that's kind of the position the Big 12 is in. Big 12 has some very good programs capable of good seasons, but we're kind of projecting ahead. That's where it's hard to know that success because these programs haven't year in and year out been as consistent as a team like Utah. You have the Kansas States and the TCUs who were really good last year and then a little bit of a down year this year, right? So that's where this stuff can become complex. And then looking to Utah's 2025 opponents, this one, it's funny how Utah won't play Colorado, they do play Colorado at home, of course, but it is funny to see like just kind of some of the changes like that. Like you don't play Arizona anymore in 2025 too. So and then going to the 2025 schedule too, it's just another one I think matches up pretty favorably for Utah. Like going to BYU is going to be a fun matchup as always. To Baylor, we just saw Utah win there. At Kansas is fun. That's one thing about like Utah's next year schedule where I'm like, man, Kansas football and then even Kansas State to some degree they're in a pretty good position right now in the Big 12. Utah misses both those teams next year versus 2025. They will have to play both, but that'll be interesting to see what position that Kansas program's in because their coach Lance Leipold, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I might have messed it up, but he's a really good coach. I don't know how long he's going to be there, and can they we know they were down for a while after for a long time because they couldn't get good coaching there. So was Leipold just going to be their one good coach recently, or are they going to be able to find a few other ones? I think that's what I'm very interested and curious to see how that all plays out. As for the home opponents, Texas Tech is not the strongest right now. Kansas State, like I said, next year. But once again, like Utah's at home. I really think that Utah is in a favorable position with this schedule as I look over it. I think that this is a Utah team that has a really good chance to continue to be involved in college football playoffs in the race for them and now make them because the team format is going to be expanding to 12. So I like the way the schedule broke out, but I think I was always going to. Once again, the Big 12 is not in the strongest position right now. And because their two best members are Texas and Oklahoma. And that's not like, oh, that's not legacy. That's this year. And yes, I know Kansas just beat Oklahoma, but it was at home. Who on a neutral site, who would you guys take? I'd take Oklahoma. I think if you ask anyone like in 2023 right now, who are the best two teams in the Big 12, you would get Oklahoma and Texas. Those are the two teams in the top 15 because TCU's fallen off. Kansas State's not as good as they were last year. Even Kansas trending in the right direction, but they had some tough losses too. So Utah is in a strong position. They're arguably going to be the best football program in the Big 12 next year. I think I probably would argue they would, and that sounds like a future title of a Locked On Utes episode. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, love seeing the early schedule and opponents, and especially as 2024, just missing a couple of the teams that would be even more challenging, I think works out well for Utah. Now it just becomes the question of who comes back, whether it's a Cam, how does it breaking in a new quarterback all that go over? If he doesn't, lots of up in the air and still unknown, and other things that will be answered and we'll be discussing on future episodes of Locked On Utes. But we do have a game this week, so I definitely want to talk about that and talk about Utah's keys to victory against Arizona State. We're going to be diving into that in one moment. But first, I want to talk to you guys about one of the sponsors of today's episode in Locked On Utes, in our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. You can score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including the spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So you can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Oh, and going with FanDuel too, I also wanted to update you guys on the Arizona State-Utah line. Now up to 11.5, was originally 10.5, just continues to trend towards Utah. And I think that makes sense. Just this is a Utah team that's been so strong at home, no doubt. And they respond well after losses, especially when they're at home too, right? This is a Kyle Whittingham-led football team. I do expect Utah to cover that 11.5. I actually think this game, I think at halftime, some of you who, if you do make that decision, will be sweating it a little bit, just because I think this Arizona State team has some decent playmakers on it defensively and can do some things offensively. Talked about some of the guys I like Scatabo offensively. So I do think they have players that have the potential to be able to make plays. But yeah, I just see Utah being able to get a win here by over 12. I do. And I agree with FanDuel there. So I'd head over to FanDuel and get in on that action if I was you guys. As I said, don't worry if it doesn't start out fantastically. Remember how many games last year, if you look back at the Arizona game, the Stanford game, the first quarter didn't go Utah's way, and then they were able to get right. I think that's what this Arizona State game could very well end up being. But already coming back into this one, want to talk to you guys now about my keys for Utah's victory against Arizona State. This is a team that was on quite the losing skid, Kenny Dillingham's first year, but they were able to get right against a team that is getting very wrong at the moment in Washington State. They're just not trending in the right direction. But credit them for getting that win. And this is a Utah team that, when you talk about their keys to victory against Arizona State, I really think if Utah wins the line of scrimmage, I think they're going to win this game. And I said that about the Oregon game too, but this one in particular is different to me because, and I'll get more specific, don't let the Sun Devils establish the run. And by comparison, if you're Utah, you want to be able to, I do think Utah will have some success rushing the ball. I think the key for Utah to winning this game is playing not just mistake-free football, because that's just, it's kind of generic again, but really protecting Bryson. Yes, Utah wants to run the ball. I expect them to run the ball, but the key will be when you get the run game going a little bit and you decide to hit him with the play action pass or get Bryson on the roll out, see if he can get something set up deep, is give him the time to try to make that throw versus having pressure on his face. That's where we know he turns it over. So I really think those are the main keys for Utah, because when you're looking at this Arizona State team, Scatabo is really nice. I really like the things he does. He can make tackles. He can make defenders miss at a high level. Also does a great job of just getting involved in the passing game too. He's even thrown some passes this season. Kenny Dillingham is very creative offensively, so he's going to try to continue to put Scatabo in positions to succeed. And that's where Utah just has to be ready for whatever kind of changes or decisions they try to make, because Utah is going to be tested in some ways in that regard, where you're dealing with a creative play caller who's going to be moving around and putting his players in position to succeed. So that's where I'm very curious to see how Utah is able to handle and manage that when it comes to Scatabo. But yeah, if you're Utah, I mean, really stop the run. And then if you get him in lots of third and longs, this is a quarterback in that for the Sun Devils that has turned it over at times this season. And he hasn't even been the starter originally. It was originally Rashada, then out. There's been a kind of a revolving door in some ways a little bit for Arizona State. So that's where I think that you could have a chance, even though I think Bourguet is doing some nice things for them. If you give him time, he can make some throws, and made some really good throws against Washington State, probably playing his best football right now. Get pressure in his face. No quarterback does well with that. So if you don't let the run game get going, that puts the game on the hands of on the shoulders of Bourguet. And I think that's where Utah could really get to work. And I do expect Utah to have another game with they force 2+ turnovers. Could definitely see that even being 3. And we'll be talking about which players specifically I think will do that on tomorrow's show. That'll be our prediction show. But I do think this is a Utah team that is going to have success against the Sun Devils defensively. And then I think offensively too, I think they're more than capable. Yes, the front seven for them is good, but you leave extra guys in the block. There's a reason Utah was ranked in the top 15, even though they did not look like one against Oregon. Once again, that's more Oregon. Listen to the way I was watching the college football ranking show. Listen to the way that some of those guys, Kirk Herbstreit was talking about Oregon. I heard Joel Klatt of Fox, the way he talks about Oregon. Joel Klatt said he hasn't seen 3 teams better than Oregon. So he's putting them in the class of Michigan and Ohio State. And I think if he was doing a tier list, he'd probably have them above, but he'd have Oregon right below them, which is pretty good. And I think there's a lot of people who think Oregon is legit, not just playoff contender, but a potential national champion contender. When you look at overall, their only losses at Washington, and in a lot of ways, they outgained the Washington Huskies by over 100 yards in that game too. So that's where it's kind of deceiving a little bit that, Oregon is the Oregon is the lower ranked team at the moment because it feels like everyone's more scared of them than the Huskies, especially because the Huskies almost lost to Arizona State. And if you didn't watch my episode yesterday, how like, oh, well, Arizona State almost beat Washington. That was such a weird game where Washington had some horrendous turnovers and Michael Penix just did not play well. And their ground game, I mean, they did not run for enough yards. They didn't even really try to establish the run. So that's where I think Utah will do a much better job of establishing the run. Whether you talk about Jaquindon Jackson's physicality and ability to break tackles, also factoring guys like the quick Sione Vaki, this offensive line will want to have a good bounce back game. Coach Witt said the game plans weren't good enough either. So I think that's where Morgan Scalley and Andy Ludwig will see response from both of them. And I do think we'll see a successful Saturday for this Utah defense. I think that they're going to do a good job getting after the quarterback, doing a good job establishing the run, preventing them from establishing the run. Utah wins at home. This is a physical team. I could definitely see them scoring early in this game, but also the altitude. I think they'll get worn down. I could see them, getting some drives, but they stall out, ending in field goals to Utah. Still keep track of Badger. They're a good receiver on the outside, but once again, just like the more that Bourget is throwing, the more Utah, and the more I like that because that means they're not having success running the ball, and that's what this team really likes to do. And Utah is going to have to be strong tackling on the outside too. Their corners, that was something that they struggled. JT brought in a little bit all year, has missed a couple tackles. Got to be sharp in this game because there's going to be some plays where he's going to have to make a tackle or two on a guy like Scatabo, and he can do that, but he's got to be able to do it more consistently where he has had those missed tackles this season. So I feel like it's just going to be a bounce back game for Utah overall. We'll do final predictions and all that type of stuff tomorrow, but I'm very optimistic about the performance that Utah is going to have on Saturday. They just respond well after losses. And the matchups here, once again, like the Utah front seven is good overall. Even though Oregon had success on the ground, they actually didn't eclipse, if I'm correct now, they didn't eclipse 100 yards rushing. Like Bucky Irving did a good job, and that was the numbers were deceiving. I thought Oregon ran the ball, and some of those numbers showed, but that's also a credit to this Utah defense who did hold Oregon to their lowest point total of the season. Yes, they still crossed 30, and it was still not a great showing by the Utah defense, but they still had the best success of any other team taking on the Ducks offense. So I just think that's something to keep in mind as we look going forward. And yeah, I still think Utah's really good, and I think that they'll have a bounce back game here. And we'll be doing our final predictions ahead of the game tomorrow. But let me know what you guys think prediction wise. Who do you think? Do you think that Utah's going to have success against Arizona State? And let me know too what you think of just the Big-12 schedule being revealed. Look forward to seeing those comments you guys have. I want to talk about the men's basketball season at hand and talk about some of the predictions I have for the Utah men's basketball team in one moment. But first, I want to talk to you guys about another sponsor of Locked On Utes today in our friends at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. We are the easiest and most exciting ways to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than 2 to 6 players' stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. With PrizePicks, it's the most fun I've had, winning up to 25 times my money this football season, and now I can play during basketball season too. You just select 2 or more players and pick more or less of their projected stats and place your entry. For example, do you think that Steph Curry is going to score more than 29 points and Nikola Jokic for more than 10 rebounds? Then you can head over at PrizePicks. I mean, Curry throws up over that a lot, and we know Nikola Jokic does a lot more than rebounds, so I think I like those odds. And also with PrizePicks, they have quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, an enormous selection of players and stat types are what make PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. You can go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Make sure you guys head over to PrizePicks and get in on the action today. All righty, closing this one out. Utah men's basketball going into the 3rd season for Craig Smith's team, and I think it could be another one with good results. I think Utah is going to be a top 8 team in the Pac-12. Last year they were in the top 5 for so much. I felt like that was a lot of favorable scheduling because some of the best teams in the Pac-12 last year were obviously the California schools and both Arizona schools. Utah, they earned the upset over Arizona, but they didn't have to go out on those tough road trips until really late in the year. So that was 4 losses that were kind of baked into the back end of their schedule. And it kind of deceived us where this Utah basketball program really is amongst the Pac-12 teams a year ago. This year, like I said, I think they'll be a top 8 team. And, great to have Brandon Carlson back. That's the big thing, too. Cole Badgema, adding him. Also get a guy like Hunter Erickson from Salt Lake Community College who can hopefully contribute a little bit, too. no Marco Anthony this year, but you get Smith coming over from Georgia Tech, a uber athletic guard who's going to be able to make some plays to Raleigh Worcester, his comfort and familiarity with the system. Gabe Madsen, the sharpshooter that he is. This is going to be a tough out in the Pac-12. I think this Utah team will do some good things this season. And I do think, I'll say this will be the first year under Craig Smith that Utah will win a game in the Pac-12 tournament. And I do think Utah will make the NIT. It's hard for me at the moment to say they'll make the March Madness field. And I think someone recently listed them as a first 4 out contender, but I just still feel like there are just a few players and a few pieces away from really being a tournament team, especially because I don't expect them to win the Pac-12. So I think they're going to continue to have tough losses. The Arizona game was huge last year, and I think Utah will earn another nice win at home this year, a top 25 win. I don't see them, beating a top 5 team again. It's kind of hard to predict that. It felt like last year Utah was going to get that big win, but then we know how bad the season turned for Utah at the end. And I don't know if they're going to be able to start that strong this year with a win of that caliber, just because I said with last year, it felt like, Marco Anthony being there. And I don't know, it felt like a good mix of youth and veterans there. And this, get Lawson Lover. And Utah can absolutely be better this year. And they probably will be regular season wise for them. We're just going to have a better idea of who this Utah team is. There was a while Utah was a 3 seed in the Pac-12. That's just not it. I think Utah will just be more kind of hovering around that 7th range. And I'm excited for the opportunity this team has. I could see them potentially getting hot and winning 2 games in the tournament. And once again, they'll upset and beat some teams, but I still don't know if just the guard play is good enough. Can they make enough shots? Teams can take away Brandon Carlson, and then it becomes hard for them at times. So I'm curious to see the year that they have under Craig Smith, and, got to build some momentum, because going to the Big 12 is going to be an absolute gauntlet for the men's basketball team. Football, I'm thinking a lot of ways that they'll just continue to have their success, and they could very well be a conference title contender right away. But basketball is going to take a little more time to get to that same level for Utah. But yeah, I think we'll see another positive step for Craig Smith's team, and they'll make the NIT once again. And I do believe this is a team that will win a game in the Pac-12 tournament, which I think a lot of you would love to see. And I know I would as well. So it'll be interesting to see the men's basketball. I did my women's basketball predictions on yesterday's show. Crazy, it's already November. So we're in that time of the year where it is prediction time and for these sports, and they're going to start getting underway, and there'll be a lot of great action going up on the hill at Utah. So make sure you guys check it all out. There's lots of fun stuff to absorb. And of course, after you checked it out, you can come hear me talk about it on Locked On Utes. We'll be covering both teams and always all your Utah football content on Locked On Utes. Tomorrow's show, once again, the prediction one. We appreciate all of you for joining us on today's episode, and we'll see you tomorrow.